Most people believe their biggest threat is a powerful enemy. They think danger comes from aggressive competitors, open critics, or obvious opposition. The truth is far more subtle. Power is not lost in clashes or arguments. It slips away quietly. It happens when we reveal too much, react too quickly, or allow our inner turbulence to become visible. Each unguarded moment shapes perception, and perception often carries more weight than action itself. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology named it. True strength begins with mastery over oneself, over thoughts, emotions, and timing. Emotional restraint, deliberate speech, and careful observation form a presence that cannot be easily influenced. When responses are measured, power is anchored internally rather than surrendered externally. Calmness becomes an invisible fortress, steadiness a quiet edge that others cannot touch. Mastery over self is not about hiding who you are. It is about choosing how and when to reveal it, allowing influence to grow silently and deliberately. Control over your internal state creates a clarity that others cannot disrupt. Every reaction, every pause, and every carefully measured disclosure communicates stability without words. When the mind moves with intention, it becomes resilient to manipulation, impervious to impulsive judgment, and anchored in reason rather than emotion. Influence grows from this quiet authority, not from force or visibility. The more measured and deliberate your presence, the more others adjust their expectations around you instead of shaping your behavior. Steadiness becomes a form of power that is both subtle and unshakable. Consider the moments when you speak about a struggle before you have fully understood it yourself. You may think honesty builds connection, that transparency demonstrates authenticity. Yet when the emotional weight is still unprocessed, your words betray uncertainty. They do not convey insight, they convey searching, a need for reassurance. Even if those listening respond with kindness or sympathy, the impression they carry is shaped more by what they observe than by your intention. Emotional instability is readable. Subtle shifts in tone, brief hesitations, quickened speech, and over-explaining all signal that the mind has not yet settled. Observers catalogue these cues, consciously or unconsciously. Each unguarded response gives leverage. The more visible the turbulence, the more predictable your reactions become, and the less control you hold over how others engage with you. Stoic philosophy emphasizes that true strength lies in mastery of the self, in cultivating calm internally rather than seeking external validation. Strength exists not in appearances or in approval from others, but in consistent, deliberate regulation of thought and emotion. When a challenge has been examined and reflected upon, sharing it communicates growth and wisdom. When shared amidst confusion, it projects instability. Those who watch closely do not merely hear your words, they interpret your patterns. They observe the connection between emotion and action, anticipating your response before you act. Exposure becomes information, and your reactions, unfiltered and raw, provide insight that others can subtly use. Processing internally before communicating externally creates a presence of authority. It creates a space between experience and expression, where discernment guides the narrative. Moments of hesitation are not weakness, they are preparation. Reflection transforms chaos into coherence. Each thought is measured, each word considered, each disclosure intentional. Observers experience stability rather than unpredictability. Presence commands respect silently, aligning perception with the strength of self-mastery. Signals are deliberate, not reactive. Emotional clarity allows lessons to be shared without surrendering power. Stability becomes influence, control becomes presence, and what is withheld gains strength in its timing. Patterns emerge in human interaction. People are not simply absorbing words, they are analyzing, cataloging, and anticipating. Every gesture, every tone, every pause becomes data for observers to interpret. The person who exposes internal turbulence too early becomes readable, predictable, and, in subtle ways, manageable. Each unfiltered reaction signals priorities, pressures, and limits. By contrast, the disciplined mind allows these patterns to remain concealed until clarity is achieved. Observation guides understanding, and measured response preserves autonomy. Stoic awareness teaches that while we cannot control perception, we can control what we make visible. Influence grows through restraint and reflection, not through constant explanation or impulsive honesty. Timing is essential in communication. Sharing experiences after processing transforms struggle into insight. Speaking in the moment of confusion transforms struggle into exposure. The difference is subtle but significant. Lessons delivered after reflection signal competence, self-mastery, and the ability to regulate internal states. Lessons shared amidst emotional turbulence signal unpredictability and dependency. Those who understand this dynamic respond differently. They cannot exploit what is not revealed. The map of internal patterns is obscured, and influence remains anchored internally rather than seeded externally. By structuring disclosure, the individual converts vulnerability into authority, chaos into coherence, and perception into deliberate presence. The rhythm of expression matters as much as content. Repeating points, over-explaining, or justifying impulsively reveals uncertainty and weakens authority. Observers notice patterns, even in subtle repetition, and adjust their behavior accordingly. By minimizing unnecessary expression, the thinker communicates steadiness and deliberation. The space between thought and speech becomes a tool of influence. Emotional regulation is the foundation of this presence. Each pause is intentional, each word is measured. Those who master this dynamic convey authority without asserting it, presence without demanding attention, and clarity without explanation. The mind moves deliberately, silently shaping perception and guiding interaction through discipline rather than force. Early disclosure of emotional turbulence carries risks beyond perception. Trust can be eroded, expectations misaligned, and influence subtly diminished. The mind that shares prematurely reveals thresholds that others can anticipate. Each expression becomes a point of leverage. By contrast, measured disclosure, delivered after reflection and clarity, communicates reliability and insight. Observers interpret consistency, patience, and intentionality as indicators of strength. Authority emerges quietly, built on observation and restraint rather than demonstration. Presence is reinforced through discipline, ensuring that influence remains intact, even in complex social dynamics. Strategic disclosure transforms potential vulnerability into deliberate power. Nothing has such power to broaden the mind as the ability to investigate systematically and truly all that comes under thy observation, Carl Jung observed, highlighting the importance of measured reflection before expression. Applying this principle to communication transforms struggle into insight, vulnerability into deliberate presence, and exposure into authority. By observing internally, processing experiences, and selectively revealing insight, the mind preserves influence while demonstrating wisdom. Discipline in expression ensures that presence is felt rather than exploited, that perception aligns with intent, and that authority grows from deliberate action rather than impulsive reaction. Subscribing is more than a gesture. It is a commitment to self-discipline and growth. It is a choice to strengthen your mind, cultivate presence, and practice deliberate influence in every interaction. By following this path, you are not only learning principles of Stoic mastery, you are actively applying them, shaping your presence, and reinforcing your authority in the world. Even the well-intentioned desire to connect can inadvertently reveal more than intended. Sharing without processing, even with the aim of authenticity, can generate signals of neediness, anxiety, or indecision. The subtle cues of vulnerability are recorded by those around us. They are observed in micro-expressions, tone variations, and in the pacing of speech. Every observable reaction is a piece of data. Stoicism teaches that external events are indifferent. It is the judgment applied to them that matters. When internal disturbances are exposed prematurely, they color perception. Observers respond to the signals, not the intention. The internal chaos, if unregulated, is externalized as weakness. By cultivating the discipline to process first, we limit the visibility of transient vulnerabilities. We transform emotional expression into intentional authority. Expression after reflection allows for narrative control. It ensures that lessons shared are distilled, that insight is highlighted, and that experience is communicated without accidental exposure. The distinction between raw vulnerability and measured honesty is subtle, yet profound. Timing, not merely content, determines whether an expression is a tool of influence or a conduit for external leverage. Stoicism reminds us that the mind's governance over its own states is paramount. Emotions, when understood and contained, become instruments rather than liabilities. The careful observer learns from restraint. The person who waits for clarity teaches others to respect their presence, not exploit their turbulence. Strength is anchored in discernment. One must also recognize the social dimension of disclosure. Not every listener deserves access to the inner world. Access is a form of power. By controlling the flow of personal insight, the thinker manages perception. Emotional and intellectual exposure is selective. Strategic restraint does not diminish authenticity, it enhances it. The mind that reflects first creates meaning rather than giving away leverage. By observing and internalizing before sharing, one can ensure that lessons, insights, and experiences communicate authority, resilience, and composure rather than fragility. By measuring expression, by delaying revelation until understanding is achieved, influence is preserved, perception is guided, and the mind remains sovereign over what is communicated. Through careful reflection, struggle becomes insight, and vulnerability becomes intentional authority. The world reads what is shown, with deliberation. Most people assume that fairness is a universal currency, that the principles they hold dear must be shared by those around them. They believe that honesty will be met with honesty, that balance will meet balance, that goodwill will inspire goodwill. Yet life rarely operates under such an assumption. The world responds not to ideals, but to incentives. Every action carries context. Every choice is guided by self-interest. Expecting others to act according to your values projects your internal map onto an external terrain that does not exist. By presuming fairness, you create predictable reactions within yourself, revealing limits and thresholds that can be observed and navigated by others. Premature trust, immediate concessions, emotional reactions to perceived imbalance. These are signals. They indicate where your tolerance ends, how far your patience stretches, and how quickly your emotions rise under pressure. Observers notice these patterns, catalog them, and adjust their behavior accordingly. What is intended as good faith can become leverage in the hands of those who see beyond appearances. Patience and observation become essential tools. The Stoic perspective reminds us that external events are indifferent. The weight lies in how they are judged and internalized. What others do is beyond control. What you choose to reveal and how you respond is entirely within it. Emotional reactions are brief messages broadcast unintentionally, revealing patterns and vulnerabilities. By observing, rather than projecting assumptions, you create a measured space for understanding. You allow behavior to reveal itself naturally rather than presuming alignment with your moral compass. In this space, you acquire insight without exposure. You recognize consistency, inconsistency, and the priorities that guide action. This patience is not passive. It is active engagement through reflection and restraint. It is the ability to see others clearly without forcing your perception onto them, and through clarity, to preserve influence rather than surrender it. The emotional aspect of assumed fairness carries an even deeper cost. When the world fails to conform to the standards you project, surprise and frustration naturally arise. These emotions are not neutral, they are readable signals. Each subtle shift, tension in the voice, a hint of impatience, the speed of reaction, reveals the interior state to observers. They do not need overt confrontation to gain insight into your character. They watch micro-reactions, study patterns, and interpret the limits of tolerance. The Stoic approach transforms these impulses into measured reflection. By training the mind to observe rather than react, one preserves authority. Emotional restraint is not suppression, but calculation. It allows the individual to interact without revealing the interior framework of thresholds and priorities. Presence is maintained. Influence remains unbroken. Premature trust also has a cognitive cost. The mind develops internal expectations, rehearses scenarios, and anticipates reciprocity. When others do not conform, the automatic disappointment can trigger impulsive behavior. Reactive decisions based on presumption create visible inconsistencies. Observers note these inconsistencies not only in what is said, but in the subtle rhythm of response, the alignment of words with action, and the management of emotional energy. By observing first, you acquire clarity about intent and capability. You learn patterns without exposing your own. This measured approach transforms engagement into a deliberate exchange rather than a reactive or imbalanced interaction. The map of your own behavior remains concealed, while the map of others' priorities is gradually revealed. Influence accrues to those who can maintain such clarity under pressure. Control over expectation extends beyond immediate interactions. It becomes a discipline in perception, in judgment, and in the shaping of narrative. By moderating assumptions, you prevent the inadvertent granting of power to others. Through exposure of your own mental framework, you align responses with observed behavior, not projected ideals. Timing, consistency, and selective engagement communicate stability. Observers adjust to your measured presence, not your presumptions. This transforms influence into a function of discernment rather than reaction. The principles of Stoicism anchor this process. External events remain indifferent. The internal response, disciplined and thoughtful, defines the outcome. When emotional exposure is minimized and observation maximized, one maintains authority without confrontation. Man is not worried by real problems so much as by his imagined anxieties about them, Epictetus observed, reminding us that projecting expectations onto the world only creates imagined leverage for others. The mind that assumes fairness surrenders influence before it has been tested. By observing patterns, measuring behavior, and waiting for evidence before acting, one preserves not only composure, but the subtle power of influence itself. Each reaction becomes intentional. Each concession, if any, is calculated. By shaping judgment before action and withholding assumptions, the thinker protects autonomy. The careful balance of observation, patience, and selective trust allows authority to grow quietly yet persistently. Through discernment, the map of influence remains in the hands of the observer, not the external world. When a provocation occurs, the instinct is to correct, to defend, to assert control. The mind races, assembling words, arguments, justifications. Each of these rapid responses, however, carries a visible pattern, a map of the internal landscape that others can read. This map communicates thresholds, emotional pressure points, and sensitivities. The faster the reaction, the more evident the vulnerability. Even a slight change in posture, a tightening of the jaw, a pause too long or too short, all of these signals are catalogued by those with attention. Authority is rarely challenged through overt force alone. It is challenged through understanding, through anticipation, and through the subtle application of pressure. Those who act with measured patience control not only their own emotional narrative, but also the perception of those around them. The calm presence becomes a barrier, a shield against manipulation, and an indicator that internal balance is prioritized over external provocation. The rare response carries weight because it is unexpected. If reactions are constant, predictable, or reflexive, they lose meaning. Every observer begins to calibrate based on previous responses. Predictability is leverage for others. Unpredictability, carefully maintained, becomes authority. The individual who responds deliberately, choosing when, how, and to what extent to react, signals mastery without needing to assert it loudly. It is not the absence of emotion that communicates strength, but the measured presence of it. Each delayed reaction is an exercise in discipline, demonstrating the capacity to regulate perception, to manage information, and to anchor authority in steadiness rather than in verbal dominance or overt confrontation. Those who have mastered this understand that influence is a product of restraint as much as it is of action. Patterns emerge in human interaction. Repetition of hasty reactions reinforces predictability. Repetition of calm, intentional responses cultivates authority. Those who observe these patterns learn the rules of engagement without confrontation, understanding what will produce results and what will not. Each provocation is a microcosm of larger pressures, a chance to demonstrate composure and discernment. Small moments predict behavior under greater stress. Stoicism teaches that the judgment applied to indifferent events reveals character and defines strength. Consistency under minor tests communicates reliability under major ones. By maintaining measured responses, influence grows naturally without the need for assertion, argument, or defensive explanation. Emotional economy is another element often overlooked. Each reaction expends psychological energy and exposes internal priorities. Overreacting to minor provocations creates a drain, not only on the mind, but also on authority. The more visible the fluctuations of emotion, the easier it becomes for others to understand and anticipate responses. Strategic restraint conserves this energy, reserving expressive force for moments where impact is intentional and meaningful. The disciplined mind does not act to prove dominance, but to maintain clarity, steadiness, and control. Those who perceive this understand that influence is accrued silently, through observation and consistent behavior, rather than through confrontation or performance. When subtle provocations fail to elicit visible reactions, observers recalibrate. They cannot determine boundaries, pressure points, or emotional triggers. Uncertainty about the internal state creates a protective buffer. The mind that remains steady and measured in the face of small tests discourages repeated probing. Over time, influence is strengthened precisely because reactions are rare and deliberate. This is a principle of presence. Authority resides not in how often one responds, but in how intentionally one does so. The unpredictability of response preserves autonomy while maintaining engagement. Subtle provocation, when navigated with discipline, becomes a mechanism for reinforcing control rather than surrendering it. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do, Epictetus reminds, embedding the essence of measured response into the practice of self-mastery. Observing, pausing, and choosing reaction in alignment with reason and principle creates a presence that cannot be easily mapped, anticipated, or influenced. Authority emerges not from dominance, but from the careful calibration of visibility. Emotional reactions become tools, not liabilities. The individual who exercises this control demonstrates strength without demonstration, influence without insistence, and mastery without overt assertion. Consistency, patience, and selective response cultivate an internal equilibrium that resonates outward, transforming subtle provocations into silent affirmations of presence, stability, and power. Through careful attention to these dynamics, every encounter, no matter how minor, becomes a practice in self-governance. Deliberate pause, measured reaction, and emotional neutrality communicate more than words ever could. Authority is conveyed through steadiness, influence through consistency, and presence through subtlety. The observant mind navigates provocations without surrender, maintains control without confrontation, and shapes perception without speaking excessively. Each micro-encounter reinforces an internal principle. That influence is rooted not in visibility, but in deliberate, measured presence, where subtlety carries weight and restraint communicates mastery. Many people feel compelled to explain every choice, believing that the more they justify their decisions, the more others will accept them. They offer context after context, restate reasoning, and layer explanation upon explanation, hoping that clarity will strengthen their position. Yet each added word carries subtle signals. The mind registers hesitation, the tone carries uncertainty, and the repetition hints at doubt. Instead of reinforcing authority, over-explaining often reveals its absence. Observers notice patterns in speech and behavior, and what seems like thoroughness can instead communicate insecurity. Stoicism teaches that authority is grounded in the alignment of action and judgment, not in the pursuit of external approval. When words are too abundant, they dilute perception. Brevity, in contrast, conveys certainty. When expression is measured, it signals that the mind is settled, that decisions are rooted in understanding rather than in the need for validation. The careful alignment of thought and action, rather than the abundance of explanation, establishes genuine authority. The compulsion to justify often stems from a desire to manage perception. There is a natural fear that others will misunderstand intentions, interpret hesitation as incompetence, or judge decisions without context. To counter this, many adopt a strategy of over-communication, believing that more reasoning equates to more credibility. But credibility is not built in words alone, it is built in presence. When reasoning becomes excessive, it signals dependency on approval. Each elaboration, intended to clarify, often becomes evidence that the speaker lacks internal confidence. Observers absorb these cues, consciously or unconsciously, noting the pattern of uncertainty. Authority, therefore, is as much a matter of restraint as it is of explanation. The mind that masters expression demonstrates strength, not through verbosity, but through deliberation. Controlled speech allows space for others to process information without being inundated, preserving the perception of decisiveness and stability. Over-explaining also subtly invites challenge. When explanations are frequent and detailed, they open the door for debate. Every word becomes subject to scrutiny, every justification a potential point of disagreement. By attempting to secure acceptance through speech, one inadvertently creates opportunities for resistance. Others may question details, test assumptions, or probe motives, and each intervention consumes psychological energy while subtly shifting perception. The Stoic approach recognizes that influence is preserved not by preemptive defense, but by measured communication. Decisions expressed with restraint limit avenues for challenge and reduce the need for constant validation. The power of presence is amplified when explanation is purposeful, selective, and concise. Those who observe carefully notice this alignment and respond with respect rather than skepticism. Excess explanation also signals a dependency on perception. When the mind continually seeks approval through repeated reasoning, it demonstrates reliance on external validation rather than internal alignment. Observers perceive the need to convince rather than the certainty of understanding. Authority is rarely granted to those who appear uncertain or overly invested in persuasion. Influence grows for those whose actions and words reflect deliberate judgment, independent of reaction. The Stoic perspective emphasizes self-sufficiency of mind. When clarity is internalized before expression, The need for approval diminishes, presence is fortified, influence preserved, and emotional exposure minimized. The fewer words required, the greater the perceived certainty. The subtle dangers of over-explaining manifest in both professional and personal contexts. In decision-making, excessive reasoning prolongs resolution, creates space for second-guessing, and signals vulnerability to those observing quietly. In social contexts, it invites unsolicited opinions and reduces perceived competence. The balance is in knowing how much to share and when, allowing decisions to speak through action and measured expression. By calibrating the level of explanation to necessity, influence is protected. Authority is reinforced not by the volume of reasoning, but by the alignment of thought, word, and deed. Observers sense when a decision is final, when confidence is inherent, and when judgment is self-contained. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, Marcus Aurelius reflected, encapsulating the principle that internal coherence precedes external persuasion. Words that overreach cannot substitute for the strength that arises from inner resolution. By acting decisively, speaking deliberately, and avoiding the impulse to justify beyond necessity, influence is preserved and authority maintained. The careful balance of expression and action cultivates respect, stabilizes perception, and reduces avenues for challenge. Each measured statement communicates certainty, each pause before elaboration signals deliberation, and each withheld detail preserves autonomy. The mind that governs expression governs perception, and perception shapes influence. The power of restraint in explanation is not merely strategic, it is philosophical. It embodies the Stoic principle that external events are indifferent and that judgment and reaction define consequence. Over-explaining creates a conduit for doubt to reach others. Measured explanation shields authority from unnecessary exposure. Each decision expressed with minimal but precise reasoning demonstrates a mind aligned with principle. Influence grows quietly through this discipline. Confidence is communicated through brevity, presence through composure, and authority through the deliberate shaping of perception. By speaking only what is necessary, the thinker maintains sovereignty over both internal and external narrative. Intentional restraint transforms expression into a demonstration of mastery. Excessive explanation, even when well-intentioned, erodes authority by revealing hesitation, dependency, and uncertainty. By aligning thought, judgment, and action, by calibrating expression to necessity, and by preserving the internal map of understanding, influence is quietly reinforced. Authority arises not from the need to convince, but from the demonstration of resolved insight. The observer notes the alignment, registers the composure, and adjusts their perception accordingly. The fewer words required, the greater the weight of each one, and the more the mind demonstrates its sovereignty over external perception and internal clarity. Through deliberate brevity, consistency, and measured expression, influence is protected, authority is strengthened, and perception is managed. The mind that refrains from over-explaining safeguards its presence, ensuring that each interaction reflects clarity rather than uncertainty. By limiting speech to what is necessary, the thinker communicates internal coherence, cultivates respect, and prevents unnecessary exposure. Each decision stands on its own merit, each explanation carries weight, and each pause signals deliberation. Authority grows silently in the measured spaces between words, in the restraint exercised before expression, and in the mastery of what is revealed and what remains intentionally contained. This is not merely a social phenomenon, it is a reflection of the psychological principle that repetition reinforces memory and shapes identity. The human mind, and the minds observing you, are wired to retain simple statements, even when nuance is lost. Strategic awareness demands that we understand this mechanism. Weaknesses, when stated, are often interpreted as absolutes. They are shorthand for judgment, for evaluating reliability, competence, and capacity. Those who perceive these labels begin to frame interactions around them. Opportunities may diminish, tasks may be reassigned, trust may be withheld. The exposure of a vulnerability, if unframed, becomes an open invitation to influence. When repeated, it becomes a pattern others can exploit. The Stoic perspective teaches that power is maintained through careful management of what is revealed. Emotional honesty is a tool, not a default, and timing, tone, and framing define whether it strengthens or undermines presence. Framing growth rather than limitation transforms the narrative entirely. Instead of defining oneself as incapable, the focus shifts to improvement, process, and trajectory. "I am working on this" carries a different resonance than "I am bad at this." The first implies agency, deliberate effort, and an ongoing journey. The second implies static incapacity. Those observing internalize the first as evidence of resilience, adaptability, and the capacity for development. The second communicates a fixed endpoint, a limitation beyond which influence, trust, and expectation are recalibrated. The subtle difference in phrasing signals to others how to perceive engagement, commitment, and capability. Emotional tone underpins this message. Spoken with confidence, determination, and control, even admissions of struggle convey presence and intentionality. Spoken with uncertainty, hesitation, or self-judgment, the same words weaken perception and create space for others to exert influence. Social context further amplifies these dynamics. Publicly labeling oneself as weak or incapable does more than express humility. It sets a framework for interaction. The label is now a lens through which actions are interpreted, missteps are anticipated, resistance is allowed, and credibility is subtly undermined. Colleagues, friends, or even casual observers adjust their expectations in ways that protect themselves from perceived risk. They no longer approach the labeled individual as capable or resilient, but as someone defined by limitations. Over time, repeated admissions reinforce these perceptions. The individual may unconsciously align behavior with the label, creating a self-fulfilling cycle. The careful thinker understands that identity is communicated not only through deeds, but through the language that frames experience. By managing the story shared with others, one can influence perception without coercion. Vulnerability, when framed strategically, becomes a source of authority rather than a point of weakness. It signals openness without surrender. Expressing a temporary challenge as a step in growth demonstrates discernment, self-awareness, and the capacity for regulation. Reframing language creates a shield around influence. Observers receive insight into progress and commitment rather than raw instability. Strategic restraint does not deny difficulty. It controls its narrative. It prioritizes the interpretation of others, recognizing that perception governs relational power. Emotional tone, pacing, and word choice all reinforce this controlled disclosure. By managing what is said, how it is said, and when it is said, the individual maintains the integrity of presence while still demonstrating humanity. Authority is thus communicated subtly, without ostentation or defensive overcompensation. Through deliberate language, measured tone, and thoughtful framing, influence is preserved, perception is managed, and authority is reinforced. Weakness expressed as growth demonstrates mastery over self and situation. Repetition, context, and emotional clarity determine whether disclosures undermine or fortify presence. The careful balance of honesty and strategic framing creates a durable, resilient, and influential persona. By defining challenges as steps in a process rather than endpoints, the individual shapes both the internal and external narrative. Opportunities align with capacity, trust is maintained, and influence grows subtly but persistently. Authority emerges not from concealing struggle, but from framing it intentionally, demonstrating strength through discernment and communicating growth through deliberate, thoughtful expression. Influence is not merely what you do, but what you allow others to perceive. Every interaction carries information, and the access you grant, whether of time, attention, personal thoughts, or emotional openness, functions as a subtle currency. To offer it too quickly is to create the illusion of depth without providing the grounding that gives it weight. Immediate disclosure, even when well-intentioned, exposes patterns, habits, and vulnerabilities that others can observe and, in some cases, exploit. The mind that is generous with insight and emotion too early effectively relinquishes strategic advantage. Each shared detail becomes a data point, a clue about thresholds, priorities, and emotional tendencies. Observers rarely require overt signs to interpret significance. The smallest cues, when combined, construct a map of your internal landscape. When this map is available before your behavior has demonstrated reliability, influence diminishes, and your presence becomes readable rather than commanding. Layered access, in contrast, transforms presence into authority. By revealing personal information and emotional insight gradually, in alignment with demonstrated trust, you maintain control over perception. The difference is subtle but profound. Sharing in stages ensures that each disclosure is observed within a context of consistency, credibility, and reliability. Access becomes a deliberate mechanism to signal value rather than an impulse-driven effort to connect. Stoicism emphasizes the importance of patience in both judgment and interaction, suggesting that influence is preserved through careful calibration of engagement. By allowing others to perceive depth only after it has been tested, you create an impression of intentionality, stability, and discernment. Those who recognize this strategy respond differently. They do not seek to manipulate or probe because the patterns they observe suggest deliberation, not naivety. Presence becomes layered, weighted, and intentional, communicating authority quietly, yet undeniably. Early exposure often conflates openness with trust, and while it can feel connective, it carries inherent risks. Immediate disclosure can give the impression of intimacy without evidence of alignment, revealing your internal reasoning, emotional triggers, or even unprocessed vulnerabilities. Without context, these revelations invite interpretation, adjustment, or exploitation. Those observing will notice patterns of consistency and inconsistency, and in doing so, they form expectations about how you might act under pressure, in disagreement, or in unfamiliar circumstances. By controlling the flow of access, you influence the expectations and assumptions of others rather than surrendering them. The Stoic approach teaches that clarity and restraint guide engagement. External observation does not dictate your behavior unless you allow it. By layering access, each interaction signals that insight, trust, and emotional energy are earned, not automatically granted. The strategic dimension of access is not limited to the emotional or personal sphere. Intellectual openness, sharing of intentions, or revealing priorities too early similarly exposes leverage. By disclosing motives, plans, or vulnerabilities prematurely, one inadvertently guides the expectations, responses, and decisions of others. Layering disclosure ensures that these insights are granted with context and aligned with demonstrated behavior. This allows observation to reinforce authority rather than undermine it. The Stoic principle of patience underscores the importance of waiting for evidence before acting, of observing patterns before extending trust, and of shaping perception through deliberate timing. Those who master this dynamic preserve the integrity of their influence and maintain the psychological balance of interactions. Emotional intensity without consistent grounding is fleeting. Moments of dramatic vulnerability, heightened emotion, or rapid disclosure can create temporary impressions, but they rarely produce lasting authority. The mind that is open too quickly exposes the thresholds by which influence can be measured. Each reactive disclosure becomes a marker, a point of observation for others to interpret patterns, test boundaries, and apply leverage. By contrast, the individual who reserves emotional and personal insight until the appropriate context demonstrates control. Consistency over time communicates reliability. Deliberate engagement communicates discernment. Access becomes a tool to cultivate respect, rather than a channel through which influence is surrendered. Presence, carefully managed, signals competence, composure, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics without overexposure. Associate with people who are likely to improve you, Seneca advised, highlighting that discernment in relational access is essential to influence. Observing before granting deeper insight ensures that the individuals who receive access are capable of understanding, reciprocating, and respecting boundaries. The value of connection is preserved when it is aligned with reliability, and authority is strengthened when personal and emotional disclosure is measured. Strategic layering ensures that depth is earned and presence is protected. Trust develops progressively, insight is preserved, and influence grows through careful calibration. By managing access, both emotional and intellectual, the mind maintains sovereignty over its presence and guides perception rather than reacting to it. Full emotional disclosure can feel compelling. It feels honest, authentic, and even strong. The mind convinces itself that revealing everything, expressing every doubt, fear, or insecurity, demonstrates courage. It suggests transparency, integrity, and relatability. Yet the perception of honesty is not the same as the reality of influence. When every emotion flows outward unfiltered, it transfers power away from the individual rather than preserving it. Emotional leakage, even when unintentional, becomes a map for others to navigate. Observers read the contours of your reactions, chart the boundaries of your patience, and infer the thresholds at which your stability wavers. Each uncontrolled display subtly communicates not insight but exposure, not authority but malleability. Presence is diluted when emotional disclosure lacks deliberation. Those who understand influence see vulnerability without control as a doorway, not a demonstration of strength. The Stoic perspective emphasizes that respect is earned through self-mastery, not through unrestrained exhibition of feeling. Vulnerability without structure produces unpredictability. The unpredictable mind, the one that broadcasts every inner fluctuation, invites external control. When emotional states are visible before reflection, observers gain leverage. They learn where sensitivity exists, what triggers response, and how to guide interaction subtly. This is not manipulation in every case. It is simply the natural consequence of being readable. Those who remain unreadable, who exercise restraint and discipline, maintain authority precisely because they are not easily anticipated. Emotional presence, carefully calibrated, conveys reliability. People trust steadiness more than impulsive honesty. They orient around predictability, and when predictability is grounded in deliberate reflection, it is respected rather than exploited. The controlled mind establishes its own boundaries and protects its influence through intentional disclosure. Each decision about what to reveal and when it is revealed is an exercise in judgment. Timing, context, and audience are all integral. A lesson shared in the heat of uncertainty carries a different weight than the same lesson shared after reflection. Perspective expressed under stress communicates chaos. The same perspective after contemplation communicates insight. Values presented in response to immediate provocation may suggest reactivity. Values expressed through deliberate articulation suggest mastery. Presence, influence, and authority are cultivated when these distinctions are recognized. Each pause, each measured choice, each withheld impulse shapes the perception of strength without needing to assert it explicitly. This is the quiet architecture of influence. It is constructed from what is revealed, what is withheld, and how consistently behavior aligns with principle. The temptation to equate full disclosure with integrity is understandable. Modern culture often rewards honesty, equates openness with trustworthiness, and romanticizes raw emotional exposure. Yet unchecked vulnerability can create dependency, not authority. Others may feel compelled to respond, manage, or reassure, shifting relational dynamics away from the original individual. Emotional unpredictability signals to observers that guidance, influence, or interpretation is required, and in doing so, authority is ceded. The Stoic philosophy suggests that respect and power are cultivated internally first. By exercising discipline over emotional expression, one creates a presence that communicates strength without demanding validation. This disciplined presence reassures without revealing vulnerability, teaches without needing external agreement, and directs influence through quiet example rather than overt exposure. Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control, Epictetus observed, and the principle applies directly to the management of vulnerability. By controlling what is disclosed, when and to whom, one maintains freedom over perception, influence, and relational dynamics. Emotional honesty, carefully managed, supports autonomy and authority simultaneously. The individual who applies this principle understands that true integrity is measured by consistency, intentionality, and the capacity to maintain internal alignment while interacting externally. Disclosure becomes a tool, not a liability. Presence is shaped by choice, not circumstance. Stability emerges through deliberate regulation, and influence persists because it is guided by reason, not reaction. Through disciplined application of emotional regulation, selective disclosure, and the measured calibration of access, influence is preserved and authority is reinforced. Vulnerability, reframed as intentional transparency, communicates authenticity without surrendering control. The observer perceives steadiness, reliability, and insight rather than instability. Authority emerges from consistency, patience, and intentionality. Presence is strengthened when emotional expression is guided by judgment and reflection. Each moment of disclosure becomes a demonstration of mastery, each pause a statement of control, and each carefully chosen revelation a reinforcement of influence. Through these practices, vulnerability becomes a strategic instrument that preserves autonomy, maintains authority, and communicates depth without diminishing strength. Intentional management of vulnerability ensures that exposure is both human and disciplined. The careful mind recognizes the difference between insight and emotional leakage, between honesty and impulsive disclosure, and between authenticity and susceptibility. By exercising this discernment, one communicates presence, stability, and authority simultaneously. Each measured disclosure reinforces influence rather than diminishing it. Each reflection ensures clarity before expression, and each regulated emotional signal preserves autonomy. Strategic transparency creates a balance between human depth and authoritative presence, ensuring that integrity and influence coexist without conflict. The individual who masters this maintains sovereignty over perception, cultivates respect, and shapes influence through deliberate, thoughtful management of vulnerability. Influence is not given, it is earned and maintained through consistent mastery of self. The world often misleads us into thinking that power is determined by strength, intellect, or aggression, but true influence does not reside in what others can do to you. It resides in what you allow them to see and interpret. Each reaction, each display of emotion, each habitual response builds a map of your internal patterns for others to read. Predictable reactions invite management, visible turbulence invites guidance, subtle manipulation, or even exploitation. When the inner world is exposed without discipline, influence diminishes, not because of external superiority, but because the individual has surrendered the control of perception. The Stoics recognized that true authority arises from mastery over judgment and action, not from attempting to dominate circumstances beyond one's control. To preserve influence, one must cultivate a presence that communicates consistency, stability, and deliberation without relying on external validation or superficial demonstrations of power. Observation is the first pillar of this mastery. By carefully watching, listening, and absorbing patterns of behavior in others, the mind collects essential information about incentives, tendencies, and pressures without exposing its own state. Observation is not passive. It is an active engagement with the world filtered through reason, discernment, and self-awareness. Each interaction becomes a test, each reaction a measurement, each response an opportunity to refine the internal map of influence. When the observer remains unreadable, the power dynamic shifts subtly but decisively. Others can no longer predict responses, anticipate reactions, or apply pressure effectively. Presence, grounded in observation, communicates more than words ever could. It establishes authority without confrontation and demonstrates restraint without withdrawal. The person who masters this dynamic maintains autonomy even in complex, high-stakes environments. Measured response complements observation. The timing, tone, and manner in which reactions are offered reveal discipline or vulnerability. Rapid, impulsive responses signal predictability. Overly frequent displays of emotion reveal thresholds and pressures that others may exploit. Conversely, delayed, deliberate, and controlled responses communicate mastery of self and situation. They carry weight precisely because they are rare and intentional. Each measured reaction reinforces the perception of authority. It creates uncertainty in observers who can no longer anticipate the precise impact of words or actions. The Stoics emphasized that judgment should guide action. The disciplined mind waits for clarity before responding, aligning expression with reason rather than emotion. Consistency under pressure builds credibility. Composure amplifies influence. The individual who masters timing transforms every engagement into a strategic demonstration of presence. Disciplined disclosure is equally critical. Not every thought, feeling, or insight warrants immediate expression. Sharing too much, too quickly, or without context exposes patterns that others can interpret. Layering disclosures intentionally ensures that each revelation carries significance, preserves autonomy, and communicates insight rather than vulnerability. Strategic restraint does not deny honesty. It structures communication so that each interaction strengthens perception and influence. Emotional and intellectual openness become instruments rather than liabilities. By controlling the rhythm of disclosure, the individual shapes perception and guides interaction, ensuring that influence remains anchored in deliberate presence rather than reactive exposure. Presence is cultivated not through quantity of expression, but through precision, timing, and alignment with internal understanding. The combination of observation, measured response, and disciplined disclosure forms the foundation of enduring influence. When executed effectively, it produces a state in which behavior is consistently aligned with insight, timing is synchronized with trust, and growth is demonstrated through action rather than explanation. Presence is no longer contingent on external validation. It becomes inherent, steady, and resilient. Others cannot easily manipulate or anticipate reactions because the internal state remains anchored and consistent. Authority, influence, and leverage arise from the deliberate management of self and perception. Each interaction becomes a subtle reinforcement of presence, each reaction a controlled demonstration of judgment, and each disclosure an opportunity to preserve autonomy and credibility. Consider the subtle ways influence is lost when these principles are ignored. Overreaction, uncontrolled disclosure, and visible turbulence provide observers with a blueprint. They see patterns, map sensitivities, and adjust their behavior accordingly. Predictable individuals are easier to influence, easier to provoke, and easier to guide. Influence erodes not through external challenge, but through internal exposure. Conversely, the mind that maintains composure, exercises restraint, and measures disclosure remains opaque. Observers adjust strategy around such a person rather than the reverse. Influence becomes self-reinforcing, not externally contingent. Stability translates into authority. Composure becomes leverage. The subtle architecture of perception shifts in favor of the disciplined individual, and power is preserved quietly but undeniably. The act of speaking less and observing more is deceptively simple but profoundly effective. It requires restraint, self-awareness, and an understanding of the dynamics of perception. Every word, gesture, and reaction is calibrated. Each disclosure is weighed against context, trustworthiness of the audience, and the potential impact on perception. Emotional transparency is balanced with intentionality. The Stoics teach that external events are indifferent. It is the judgment, timing, and control of response that determines consequence. By preserving these elements, influence is maintained independently of external forces. The consistent practice of this principle transforms presence into authority and authority into sustainable influence that cannot easily be undermined. People are not disturbed by things, but by the view they take of them, Epictetus observed, emphasizing that influence is shaped not by the external environment, but by mastery of perception and self-regulation. Each measured action, each deliberate disclosure, each intentional pause reinforces the authority of the individual. Influence is no longer a function of reacting to others. It becomes a function of guiding perception and maintaining internal sovereignty. The mind that achieves this balance demonstrates resilience, composure, and strategic presence. Predictability gives way to deliberate uncertainty, turbulence to composure, and vulnerability to intentional transparency. Influence is thus preserved through discipline, observation, and the careful management of what is revealed and what remains contained. Ultimately, enduring influence is cultivated through deliberate practice. Observation, measured response, and disciplined disclosure are not separate skills, but integrated facets of self-mastery. By controlling perception, timing, and expression, the individual ensures that behavior is consistently interpreted as authority, stability, and presence. Others adjust their strategy around this deliberate presence rather than dictating the flow of interaction. Influence is preserved because it is anchored internally, demonstrated intentionally, and communicated thoughtfully. Each engagement reinforces composure, each disclosure signals deliberation, and each reaction demonstrates mastery. Authority is quiet, influence is deliberate, and presence becomes a form of leverage that cannot be seized by impulsive or manipulative forces. Through these practices, the mind secures its power, not through force or visibility, but through the disciplined management of self and perception. Remember this: true strength is measured not by how much you reveal, but by how much you control. Presence, composure, and deliberate action are the quiet forces that shape influence and protect your mind from being managed by others. Every choice, every pause, every measured response builds the foundation of authority that cannot be taken from you. Stand steady, observe deeply, and reveal with intention, because when you master yourself, the world adjusts around you, not the other way around. If you want to deepen this practice and sharpen your understanding of influence, click to watch one of the suggested videos on the screen. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal and for committing to growth, clarity, and intentional living alongside us.